Hello everyone and welcome back to the School of Taste. I am Nick Jackson. Great to be back with you for another week of wine tasting by structure. Week 5 of 6, so just a couple more of our sessions to go, and I hope you've enjoyed everything so far. If you're watching this on recording, thank you very much for taking the time to do that. I'm sorry you couldn't make it live, but thank you for watching the recording. If you are here watching live, as ever, please use the questions function at any point during this webinar to send your comments or your questions to me. So last week we looked at what I call the Bordeaux varieties, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Malbec, and we discovered that they have quite a few features in common when it comes to tannin structure. Now, it will be I think, a bit of a different experience this week with 3 varieties which behave in somewhat different ways. So I think it's going to be an interesting opportunity for us to take what we learned last week about how to assess tannin structure and apply it to 3 new different varieties. So let us move on to this slide, which you will remember from last time. Just as a reminder of what we're doing here. Tannin structure, once more, what gives not only the sensation of drying in the mouth, which is of course what tannin generally does, but tannin is the architecture of a red wine. It's what gives the wine purpose and shape in the mouth. It ensures it doesn't collapse in on itself, and there's something more than just fruit. In addition, I believe that tannin also supplies a slightly dry quality which can offset or balance the fruit. So those are things we'll be looking at also today. And so a reminder that we use 3 different assessments of tannin in order to arrive at a full picture of what tannin structure is for this particular variety. So simply the level of tannin, how much does your mouth dry out? The type of tannin, what's the texture of that tannin or the sensation of that tannin when you put the wine in your mouth? And then finally, the physical location in your mouth where you feel those tannins most strongly. Certainly when we get onto the Italian varieties later today, you're going to experience a lot of tannin. There's no doubt about that. So a couple of points there. First of all, don't hold the wine in your mouth for too long, because otherwise everything will feel extremely tannic, even if it's not so much so. And the second thing is, in those cases, of course, it will feel like the tannin is just coating your mouth, it's all over your mouth. But just try and really focus on where you feel those tannins most strongly. I think that's the key to understanding what I mean by the location of tannin. And once more, my argument is that for each variety, level, type, and location of tannin, you put those 3 together, you come up with a tannin structure which is correct for that variety. And then wherever that variety is grown around the world, in whatever kind of climate it's grown, those things should not change. Of course, we can have slight differences in fruit profile or perhaps body weight and things like that, but the tannin structure, which is unique to that variety, should not change depending on what happens in the vineyard in terms of climate and what happens in the cellar in terms of winemaking. Okay, so our first variety, excuse me, today is, before we get to the Italian varieties, is Pinot Noir, which is always a gorgeous wine to taste. So probably not, honestly, Pinot Noir, a variety that we think too much about tannin when we're thinking about Pinot Noir, but nonetheless, I think there are some things to say, some interesting things to say about tannin in Pinot Noir. And so please, why don't we first of all just assess the wine that we have in our glass, and we'll do aromas and flavors first, as I always like to do, just so we can kind of get those out of the way and I'll allow our minds to focus on structure, but we have to think about flavor first. So why don't you go ahead and use the questions function and tell me what aromas and flavors you're getting in your Pinot Noir. And please also tell me at the same time from what region your wine comes, so I can kind of assess whether those are typical or expected or unusual flavors and aromas. And then once we've done that, we'll get onto the tannin structure of Pinot Noir. So let's see what you guys have got. Okay, so Louise has got an example from Burgundy, in fact, from the village of Savigny-les-Beaunes, which can always be a source of great value red Burgundy for anyone who's looking. Louise has got dried cranberries, ash, dark cherry, leather, raspberry. Yeah, very nice. Sounds very true to type. I think Savigny-les-Beaunes is also a great place for those people who like those mature, kind of mulchy, wet leaves aromas that great Burgundy can assume, often with bottle aged. One of the benefits of Savigny-les-Beaunes as an appellation is that Savigny doesn't take forever for those notes to develop. So even a 10-year-old example, village Premier Cru level, will start to have those notes. So if you like that in Burgundy, then Savigny is a good place to go to. Jean-Luc is in Mercury, bright cherry, raspberry, touch of earth, Mercury in Burgundy also. Kathleen in Monterey, California, ripe cherry, strawberry, red plum, vanilla, earth currant, rose petals. Sounds like a lot of stuff going on there. Also forest floor, Kathleen says. Sounds delicious, so perhaps more on red fruits. Very good. Lynn has got Giant Steps from the Yarra Valley. Giant Steps is, I think, a brilliant producer in the Yarra Valley. Earth, forest floor, raspberry, dried orange peel, red and black cherry, and a hint of vanilla. So even in the warmer climates of Australia, it sounds like Lynn is getting some, also some dried notes, some more savory notes, and not just pure fruit. So that's good. I think you're always looking for that in Pinot to somehow get something beyond just fruit, right? Of course, Pinot Noir is an eminently fruity wine, but it's also so capable of taking on those other aromas and flavors that I was just talking about in connection with Burgundy, but which also in many other Pinot growing regions you can find too. Meltem has got a Côte de Beaune Village, 2015, red cherries, raspberry, savory. Good, and that combination between sweet red fruits and a savory finish, I think is quite typical of Burgundy. So that sounds great. Okay, so why don't we think now a little bit about tannins in your Pinot Noirs. So the first thing we're going to think about is the level of tannin. How much does it dry out your mouth? Maybe think about the benchmarks in your head. What's your benchmark? Is, say, a Merlot. Is Merlot a benchmark for you? I would say that's usually a moderate tannin variety. Is Pinot Noir the same or less than that? Of course, it depends a little bit on climate, but maybe Cabernet is a more tannic variety. Maybe that's a high tannin variety. Where does Pinot fit on the spectrum for you in terms of the level of tannin? And Gianluca is saying medium tannins for that example. Let's see what you guys have got. Otherwise, Louise is saying moderate. They are there, but not dominant. It's interesting, isn't it? Because remind me, and we'll talk about this in the context of the Italian varieties later. Those, excuse me, tannins in the Italian varieties can almost seem to be the dominant feature. But Louise is making the point that even though they're there, they're certainly not the dominant feature here. Another way of phrasing the same thing is to say, what is this wine built on? And I think sometimes in the Italian examples of Italian red wines, the wines are almost built on tannin, maybe on acidity as well, but certainly on tannin. Or another region that we looked at last week, Bordeaux. Bordeaux is without doubt a region whose red wines are built on tannin. But Louise is just making the point that Pinot Noir doesn't fit that mold. Meltem, medium, and Kathleen, medium. Yeah, I think everyone's going with medium, which sounds very sensible to me. Okay, let's think about the type of tannin. What's an adjective, a word that you can find which best captures or describes the texture or the sensation of those tannins in your mouth? I have some examples there which you can use, but you don't have to rely on those. You can create your own. That's totally fine. Kathleen is saying smooth. Good. Lynn. Lynn is also saying gorgeous texture tannins, smooth and polished, velvety. Good. Meltem is also going with smooth. Very good. So certainly there seems to be some consistency among these responses. We talked last week about some examples of varieties in Bordeaux which have got some kind of grainy tannin or grippy tannin, but we seem to be in a different world here with Pinot Noir, where the emphasis is more on smooth. Louise is saying that the tannins in her example are quite smooth and lovely. Good, very nice. I'm glad you're enjoying the tannins, Louise. Okay, and finally, let's think about the location of the tannin. Is there somewhere in your mouth where you feel those tannins more strongly than elsewhere? I mean, possibly it's a little bit more difficult to pick up the location of the tannins when the level is a bit more moderate. Perhaps in higher tannin varieties, the location is more evident. But nonetheless, do your best and see what we come up with. Jidin is asking a question, what would be the difference between smooth and polished? I mean, I suppose I want to put my qualifier up front, which is don't get too hung up about the individual words. The most important thing is you find ones that speak to you, but can also be understood by other people. So I think the distinction between smooth and polished, excuse me, is quite a small one. So don't sweat that one too much. But smooth, I think, can be any kind of smooth. It can be velvety smooth, or it can be smooth like a wood which has been sanded down. But polished is almost like shiny. It almost reflects the light. So polished to me is an exaggeration of smooth. It's even more finely finished. Something like that, I would say. Okay, Kathleen is saying that she finds the tannins on the front of the tongue and the bottom gums. So in any case, for Kathleen, at the front of the mouth. Louise is saying gums and teeth, somewhat similar. Lynn is commenting, I get the tannins more on the tongue towards the back and the roof of the mouth, with less of an impression on the cheeks. Okay. Gianluca is saying cheeks and gums. Okay, good. So we have some people saying gums, some people saying tongue and roof of the mouth. So a few different locations there, but we can discuss that in just a sec. Meltem is saying tongue and gums. Okay, good. So why don't I forward my slides so you can see what I came up with for Pinot Noir. Okay, here we go. So a level of tannin first, low to moderate, I'm saying. So a low tannin wine would be something maybe like a Bourgogne Rouge, really a sort of entry-level wine. But most Pinot Noirs, I agree with you guys, will have moderate levels of tannin, I would say. I think that's totally fine. The type of tannin, smooth, I certainly agree with. I have no issue with that. I'm just trying to sort of be a bit more descriptive, perhaps unnecessarily so. Maybe I'm being too detailed here, but I'm saying silky, velvety. So certainly silky and velvety are variations on smooth. And then I also just want to throw powdery in there. Powdery may not be quite as smooth a sensation, but certainly I don't think it's inconsistent with those things. Powdery is almost just like the smoothness. It's just breaking down a little bit, but not in a harsh way. It's still in a kind of soft way that caresses the palate as the tannins pass over. And then the location of the tannin, I'm actually going with tongue here, as some people said. Some people were commenting about gums. To me, if we think about the wines we had last week, the Bordeaux varieties, think about Cabernet, which is the horseshoe Cabernet tannins felt so strongly around the gums. To me, we're in a bit of a different world here with Pinot Noir. I always comment that the fruit of a wine, of a red wine, is felt on the tongue, right in the middle of the mouth. That's why I sometimes call it mid-palate fruit. The tongue is the middle of the mouth, the mid-palate. And in Pinot Noir, I do find the tannins really to be in the same place as the fruit, right there on the tongue. Again, I repeat what I said before, that of course that doesn't mean you can't feel the tannins elsewhere too. But for me, I find a concentration of those moderate level tannins on the tongue. And then what I would also urge you to think about is perhaps a little bit of a sense of movement in where you feel those tannins too. I, for instance, feel that on the tongue, perhaps at the beginning, and then perhaps almost as if they're rising the longer you hold the wine in your mouth, so much so that you feel them on the roof of the mouth. A little bit later, a few seconds later. So it's a kind of a weird sensation, this sort of rising sensation. Do any of you guys get that in your wine? Louise is saying, on the tongue, I feel the acidity very strongly in this wine. Yeah, let's talk about acidity in just a sec. I think that acidity is such a relevant aspect of Pinot Noir. Kathleen just saying that she suddenly gets that rising sensation. I mean, one of the things about Pinot Noir is, which we haven't really commented on yet, clearly it depends where you're growing this variety, but if you're growing it in Europe, in Burgundy, in Germany, in Alto Adige, other cool climate places in Europe, then you might only have a light-bodied wine or perhaps medium-bodied at most in the whole world of wines, right? Compared to like a Cabernet or a Malbec or something. If you're in Australia, South Africa, or USA, you might have slightly more body, just as a reflection of the climate. But certainly in those cooler climate examples, the lightness of the body and the only moderate concentration and weight of the fruit doesn't leave much space to conceal the acidity. So the acidity can be quite prominent in Pinot Noir in these medium-bodied examples. Of course, generally speaking, there's a direct relation between fruit ripeness and concentration. As that goes up, acidity goes down. So if you have a lighter example of Pinot Noir from a cool climate, it has only light concentration of fruit and quite high acidity. Now, I do think Pinot Noir can retain its acidity quite well in most cool climates. So much so that even in climates like New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, perhaps not so much California, but certainly in those places, you're certainly going to retain that line of acidity. So certainly acidity, I think, is a feature of Pinot Noir. Lynn, I definitely had the tannins on the tongue, then moving to the roof of the mouth. So yes, rising, good. The other thing I want to say about this strange rising sensation is that in the context of Pinot Noir as a variety, as a wine, that is not a totally perhaps unexpected or unnatural sense, that rising sense. Why? Simply because Pinot Noir is one of the most aromatic red varieties. Pinot Noir relies on the beauty of its aromas as a key part of the success of the wine. People love Pinot Noir because it smells so wonderful, as well as tastes so wonderful. And so many Pinot Noirs from Burgundy and from elsewhere, the aromas just seem to leap out of the glass. And that sense of the aromas rising up out of the glass gives a whole sense of lift to the wine. And then if the tannins do the same thing as well, they seem to rise from tongue to the roof of the mouth, then you've got two different ways in which the wine seems to be lifted. So people often talk about lifted aromatics in a wine, which means, to my mind at least, they kind of hover above the top of the glass. But here we've also got a kind of sense of lifted tannin. So the whole wine is on an upward journey. And I think that's one of the magic tricks that Pinot Noir can do so well, this sense that it's not really earthbound, that it aspires to be airy and in the heavens. I think that's one of the subtle things that Pinot Noir does so wonderfully, and which we don't often comment on, but what goes into making it such a brilliant and successful variety. The last thing I want to comment on under the other terms bullet point here is what I'm calling this mono-textured wine. So if you remember last week, we were talking about Merlot, and I was commenting that Merlot is an example of a variety which is what I call a two-textured variety. That is, the tannins, as we remember in Merlot, are grippy and maybe a bit clay, like clayey, or even grainy in some examples. But the fruit is just so smooth, perhaps even polished in some examples. So there's a contrast between the texture of the fruit and the texture of the tannins. That's why I call it a two-texture variety. Usually we think that all wines just have a texture, but in the case of Merlot, there's two textures going on at once. But my argument is that Pinot is the other end of this story. Pinot is where you only feel one texture, because the quality of the tannins is such that it matches the quality of the fruit. Both of them have got this kind of smooth, velvety, silky sensation. So another trick that I think Pinot pulls off so successfully is to give this absolutely consistent texture in the mouth, because the tannins and the fruit feel just the same. And so what does that give overall? It just gives a sense of complete harmony, of a wine at peace with itself. There's no hard edges, there's nothing rough or unexpected. It's just completely consistently smooth and polished and elegant. And again, I think that's another reason why, subtly speaking, if you really think about it, that could be one of the reasons why I think Pinot Noir is so successful worldwide, the absolutely effortless texture of the fruit and of the tannins. It's not to say, by the way, that Pinot Noir can't occasionally have pretty firm and pretty serious tannins. If you are lucky enough to drink Premier Cru, but especially Grand Cru Burgundy, maybe from the Côte de Nuit in a village like Gevrey-Chambertin, or perhaps Mory-Saint-Denis, those northern villages in Burgundy, then you'll know that they have a pretty serious frame of tannin around the fruit. And that tannin is pretty rigid and pretty firm. But the point remains, nonetheless, that tannin is very fruity tannin, it's very ripe, and it still has the same texture as the fruit. In the case of the Bordeaux examples last week, we were talking about how those tannins could be fruit wrapped in Cabernet or Merlot, that they're kind of muscles enclosed by flesh. So you don't really ever see them. They're there and you feel them, but they're not separate from the fruit. And that happens to an even greater extent with Pinot Noir, I think. To say they're fruit wrapped is true, but it's even more than that in the case of Pinot Noir. It's that you don't know where the tannin ends and the fruit begins. And part of the reason for that may be, again, that the textures of the two are so similar. So it's just interesting to, I think, to break down Pinot into these slightly abstract concepts, perhaps, but which give us perhaps an insight into why it's such a celebrated variety and why so many wine lovers, they end up drinking more Pinot Noir than anything else. Okay, so any other comments on Pinot Noir? Any other thoughts, any other questions before we move on? I think you see what I mean, that even though it's one of those varieties which I think we feel like we know very well and we don't necessarily think so much about tannin, then nonetheless, I think there's quite a lot that we can say. So I hope you find that interesting. Okay, so let's move on to the second wine, Sangiovese. While you're pouring your wine, again, tell me where your example comes from and where your example comes from and the aromas and flavors that you're getting. We're obviously moving to a slightly different world, away from Pinot Noir and to Italy. I assume that most of you have got an Italian example, but if you've got somewhere else, that's great too. But tell me what you're tasting in terms of aromas and flavors and where your example comes from. So Louise is just asking a question which I can happily answer while we're pouring these examples of Sangiovese. So Louise is making a point about the fact that Pinot Noir is, of course, a hugely important variety in Champagne and in other sparkling wines as well, in English sparkling wine, in French Ricotta, and of course, many New World sparkling wines. Louise is asking how to differentiate the acidity from Chardonnay when you're tasting Champagne. Well, I mean, how do you differentiate the two varieties when you're tasting sparkling wine? Let's just ask that. So first of all, I think the acidity, if you have a blend of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in sparkling wines, I think most of the acidity is going to come from the Chardonnay, of course, as we discussed, the super linear, laser-like intensity of acidity from Chardonnay. But then what gives a bit of mid-palate fruit that we were just talking about, fruit felt on the tongue in the middle of the palate, that comes from the Pinot Noir. So, of course, that can be citrus fruit, but often in Pinot Noir, in sparkling wines, it can also be red fruits. So that's something to look out for. But generally speaking, just remember that Chardonnay is always in such a rush to go somewhere. It doesn't really have too much focus on the mid-palate, the fruit on the tongue. So if you get that, some fruitiness right there on the tongue, then you should probably consider the possibility there could be some red varieties in here as well. Pinot Meunier also has the same effect of giving a generosity of fruit on the tongue, even more so than Pinot Noir, but perhaps slightly less complex fruit, more open, more aromatic when young, but perhaps just at a slightly more fruity, generous register rather than the subtle complexities that we know and love in Pinot Noir. And I think also what I would say is that Pinot Noir, even in sparkling wines, gives the slightest sensation of tannin, felt in just the places that we just talked about, of course. So a bit of structure in the wines as well. So that's what I always think about when it comes to sparkling wines. Okay, so the Sangiovese, Kathleen has got Chianti Classico, dark cherry, barnyard, manure, leather, dirt, earthy, tomato leaf, so very savory from Kathleen's example. Gianluca, Greve, a village in Chianti. Chianti Classico Riserva, ripe red cherry, classic note, isn't it? Ripe red cherry for sour cherry, maybe, Gianluca, do you think? Strawberry, dried, grilled herbs, oregano, cedar. Sounds like a delicious example. Louise in Chianti Classico, cherry, roses, terracotta, thyme. So interesting consistency of herbal note in some examples. Red bell pepper and tomato. Lynn, Chianti Classico Reserva 2016. Ruby color, yeah, it's good to come and comment on the color. I think that Sangiovese, it may not have such a light color as Nebbiolo that we're about to get onto in a minute, but nonetheless, the color is certainly on the lighter end. And I do think that ruby is just such a great descriptor for the color of Sangiovese. Maybe a slightly dusty ruby, but ruby nonetheless. Gidin from Chianti Classico, dark cherry, medicinal herbs, raspberry, earthy, tobacco leaf, savory. Yeah, so a lot of emphasis here on the savory notes. So a combination on the one hand of these cherry notes, whether it's kind of the sour cherry, but then the herbal and then the earthy notes as well. So quite a lot going on. And I also think, by the way, guys, that a lot of you have got Chianti Classico. Yeah, some of you have got the Reserva examples, which are obviously more expensive. But if you get the regular Chianti Classicos, you know, we're paying $20, $22, $24, pounds, euros. And those are, you're getting a lot of complexity just reading your notes for a wine of that price. And I think that's fantastic. And that's why I think the Chianti Classico is one of the great value red wines in Europe. So Corey is saying his Rosso di Montalcino has got lots of oak. So perhaps a bit more oak used in the Brunello region, in the Montalcino region rather than the Chianti region. I agree with that. Shengli is also in the Montalcino region with a Brunello from 2013, which is a vintage that I love. Pale garnet color for Shengli, so quite a pale color. Orange peel, classic note of ripeness, I think, in red wines, orange peel. Licorice, yeah, licorice is very good. That kind of dark bitterness that you get in some quite ripe examples, combined with tart cherry and sanguine, bloody, good Shengli. Meltem Chianti Classico 15, sour cherry, dried flowers, smoky. Yeah, there's a lot of smoky notes, aren't they, in these Sangiovese wines? Herbal, spices, very good. Okay, those, you're making my mouth water. I've got a Brunello 2015. And yeah, it smells a lot like what you guys were just saying. The only note I would add from my wine is I get a chocolatey note from my Montalcino 2015. 2015 is a ripe vintage. You don't always get that note in Sangiovese, but I think it's a ripeness thing, a vintage thing in 2015. And maybe a balsamic note as well. I think that's such a consistent thing. Okay, now let's talk about tannin, the level of tannin. Most of you have either got Chianti Classico or Reserva and a couple of Brunellos for Shengli, and Corey's got a Rosso. Okay, so let's talk about the level of tannin in your example. I have to say, in my example, regular Brunello di Montalcino, 2015, young Brunello, I have high tannins, a lot of tannins in my example. And Corey's Rosso di Montalcino, medium plus, and fruit wrapped, good. What finish is that, Corey? 2016, well, there we go, 2016, just fabulous fruit wrapped tannins in that excellent vintage. Meltem, high levels of tannin, good. Lynn, moderate to medium plus, okay. Kathleen is saying the same thing. Louise is saying high and dominant. Yeah, the tannins, perhaps Louise is saying dominate the wine a little bit. Gianluca, medium plus for Chianti. Sandy and pretty powerful, good. And Jidin is also saying medium plus. So some variation from medium plus to high, depending on where the wine comes from. In general, I expect Montalcino region to have higher levels of tannin than the Chianti region. A bit further south, usually slightly riper, warmer fruit, more concentrated wines in Montalcino than Chianti. The only exceptions to that, I would say, are the Chianti Reservas or the Gran Seleziones, which perhaps might be harvested slightly riper with more density of fruit and of tannin. But in very general terms, I expect more tannin in Montalcino than in Chianti. In Shengli's Brunello, Shengli's got medium plus levels of tannin. Shengli's vintage, however, is 2013, which is a vintage I love because it's a very aromatic, very fresh vintage in both Barolo and in Montalcino, but it's not a blockbuster vintage. It's not heavyweight, dense fruit, and that may account for why Shengli's tannins are only moderate plus for a Brunello. Okay, the type of tannin, what's an adjective that you can find that speaks to the texture of those tannins? Okay, so Gianluca is saying sandy and pretty powerful. Lynn, grainy or sandy or dusty tannins, but not gritty or abrasive. Okay, good. So Lynn is drawing a contrast between sandy, but not being abrasive, not aggressive or too drying out. Uniformly spreading over the tongue and the roof of the mouth, good. Kathleen agrees with sandy. Gianluca likewise, but Gianluca adds sandy, almost grainy. Louise says rough tannins, clinging on. Okay. Corey says for the Rosso, sandy seems correct, or grainy too, you could also say. Alice, medium plus tannins, and a little rustic or dusty. Okay, good. And then finally, the last piece in this, where do you feel them on your palate? What's the spot where you feel those tannins the most strongly? Some of you have already commented on it, but please tell me. Anyone else? Let me check in my example. Okay, good. Kathleen is saying she feels them on the gums. Louise saying on the upper gums, excuse me, on the sides and in the lower gums in the middle. So a lot of emphasis on gums, I think, for Louise. Jidin saying sandy textures on the gums. Corey saying all over, okay. Lynn, tannins are pretty compact and focused, where they were a little more generous in the Pinot Noir. Yeah, I think a super interesting comparison, Lynn. I think that you do feel the tannins very easily in Sangiovese, right? They don't hide. Remember, I was just talking about the either the fruit wrapped tannins of Pinot Noir, or even better, the sort of melding of the fruit and the tannins, so you don't know where the one begins and the other ends in Pinot Noir. You don't have that issue in Sangiovese. I think you can very clearly detect the tannins as being distinct from the fruit. Gianluca, the gums and the back of my cheeks. Okay, good. So certainly around the sides of your mouth for Gianluca. Meltem also saying the tannins are felt everywhere. Okay, so let me see what I say on my slide. So I'm saying moderate level, but equally well for Brunello, or I would go high. So maybe I was thinking more about Chianti, but certainly Brunello, Chianti Reserva would be much more like high. I think sandy is the best word. Many of you said that. But if you want to go somewhere about grainy or whatever, then I've got no issue with that. But sandy just in the sense of being like sandpaper, like you can almost feel these tiny little grains in your mouth, but very firm grains. They're not going anywhere. They're like sand. You can't break it down. The location of the tannins, I do think, is this is another gum wine. We saw with the Bordeaux varieties, they were consistently felt on the gums. I think this is much the same. I especially get them on the front gums, but I also get them going all the way to the finish around the edge of the mouth, around the gums as well. So if it may touch on the cheeks there as well, perhaps a little bit, but I do think the focal point of these tannins is on the gums. But this is, I think I would take a moment here just to point out that this is where you have to put all three aspects together, because if you think about the Merlot and the Cabernet that we had last week, the level of tannin in those could have been moderate, certainly for the Merlot, maybe a bit higher for the Cabernet. And the location of the tannins was certainly on the gums. And so could you confuse Merlot and Cabernet with Sangiovese because of the level and location of tannin? No, of course you couldn't, because the type of tannin, the texture of tannin is so different. And so that's where it's so useful to look at all three categories. So that's interesting. Jidin is just commenting, do you know why scientifically we fill them so much around the front of the gums? It's just sitting there for me. I do think Jidin is correct. I do think the Sangiovese is a great example of a variety to look at where you just feel them so strongly on the gums. I don't know scientifically, Jidin, like I always say, I don't have any scientific evidence for why I feel what I do and what we all do. But I just do note that whatever the reason, and maybe someone will do some research on this one day, or someone already has that I don't know about, but it's so consistent. You know, some people have got Chianti, some people have got Chianti Reserva, some people have got Brunello, some people have got Rosso, and everyone feels it in the same place. So in different vintages, in slightly different regions, very consistent. Now, I do want to just address these under the other terms bullet point at the bottom here. Dustiness is the first word on here, and someone actually mentioned dusty Meltem in the discussion about the texture of the tannins, but I'm going to go with sandy. But I think Meltem is actually correct in saying that there is a dustiness to the overall texture of the wine. But my argument here is that the tannins are so obviously sandy that the dusty texture, which I completely agree with, especially in Chianti, doesn't belong to the tannins, it belongs to the fruit. So then we come back to that discussion, which I was just mentioning a few moments ago about the two textures. So Sangiovese would be another wine for me, which has got two textures. So the tannins are sandy, but the fruit has got a dusty quality to it. Yeah, it's tart, red cherry, sour red cherry, herbs, and earth. Those are the flavors we get. But there's something about the fruit which is beyond a flavor. It's more like a texture. And that texture to me is almost as if you just get a mouthful of dust. Like the wind blows, you're outside, the wind blows, and suddenly you get some dust in your mouth. And that dustiness, that dry dustiness, is so symptomatic to me of Tuscan wines from Sangiovese across the different Tuscan regions. I always get this dustiness, but particularly in Chianti. So then on those terms, I would say that Sangiovese is a bit more like Merlot in having two textures, the sandy tannins and the dusty fruit, like the grippy tannins or the clayey tannins in Merlot, and then the smooth fruit. So we are in a dissimilar world to the Pinot Noir, which we just had, which was all what I was calling monotextured. And we're back to the two-textured world here. Mid-palate. I do want to just mention the mid-palate on the wines, particularly for those of you who've got Sangiovese from Chianti. Just think about how much mid-palate fruit there is in your wine. And we're going to come back to that when we talk about Nebbiolo. Remind me if I forget. What we've talked about here is that there's a movement from moderate plus to high tannins, felt around the edge of the mouth, around the gums in this variety. But my question to you is that balanced by a big amount of mid-palate fruit? In the conversation we had last week, I was contrasting Merlot, which has got a lot of mid-palate fruit felt on the tongue, to Cabernet Sauvignon, which often has a bit of a hole in the middle of it. What do you guys think we're at with this variety? Is there enough fruit? Is there too much fruit in the mid-palate for the tannins, which are felt around the edge? It's actually quite a relevant question for the Nebbiolo as well, so we'll talk about that. While you're thinking about that, let me just say a word about the regional styles here. So clearly Sangiovese is a variety which is grown in other regions, obviously, like Emilia-Romagna, but it's especially, the variety of Tuscany. Within Tuscany, we have the two famous regions of Chianti and of Montalcino, but it always a cause of some regret to me that everyone always forgets about Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, which is another great wine from this variety, but somehow neglected. Now, let me just break down what my kind of benchmarks for understanding the different styles within Tuscany are. Chianti Classico is the coolest, so particularly in just the regular versions, the Normale, not the Reserva. You find at most a moderate weight body with high acid and very aromatic wines with all the aromas that you were describing at the beginning, just pouring out the glass. Reserva, yes, a bit more concentration. Then the next one I would go to is Vino Nobile, which has got still some of those lifted aromatics, which just want to burst out the glass, but it's got more structure, more heft, more powerful tannins, and more fruit in the mid-palate. And then finally, you have Montalcino, which in regular Brunello, the aromatics tend not to be quite as high-toned, as lifted as in Chianti versions, but you have more tannin and more fruit than ever before. So in terms of density, to me, it goes Sangiovese from Chianti, then from Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, and then from Brunello di Montalcino. Everything goes up in intensity, the fruit and the tannins, the structure, the weight of the wine. That's the way I looked at it. But I think sometimes Vino Nobile can be a good midway point. It's got the aromatics of Chianti, but some of the heft, the structure of Brunello. Okay, let's see what you guys are saying. Louise, acidity balances the fruit or the tannins and the mid-palate. Louise is saying, not sure about the mid-palate. Okay, so fine. So that's actually quite an interesting comment from Louise, which we will take into consideration. The mid-palate doesn't really seem particularly noteworthy, which is fine. So we'll talk about that more when we get to Nebbiolo. Okay, any more questions or thoughts or observations about Sangiovese? I mean, I hope you guys enjoy the variety. To me, I just think Sangiovese is fantastic. I always put it in the category of those wines where the winemaking has improved so much since about 2010. Before that period, there was more blending with international varieties in Tuscany. Of course, it should never be blended in Montalcino, but I'm sure it still happened. But now we've moved into an era where there's a lot more focus on the purity of Sangiovese, the lifted aromatic expression, and all the dustiness of the fruit and the sandiness of the tannins. So you get all that classic varietal expression. And if you enjoy that varietal expression, then happy days. I think it's such a distinctive, wonderful variety. I love it. Okay. Lynn just commenting about the acidity. The fruit and the acidity can't be separated in this wine. Yeah, I mean, a really good point to make, of course, about Sangiovese, in common with many other red varieties from Italy, is that while we've been focusing on the tannin so much, the acidity equally well is such a key component of Italian red wines. So I don't know whether any of you are getting notes of volatile acidity, like nail polish remover, that kind of very high-toned aroma. But I often get that in many Italian reds, but particularly in Sangiovese. So if you're getting any kind of balsamic notes, that's the same thing. That's a very slight hint of volatile acidity. And what that is that the acidity is so high, it's just risky. The acidity itself is risking a little bit of oxidation, and then you get it really adds a sense of lift to these aromas. So even though the aromas are already very perfumed, the wine is already very aromatic, when you combine that natural tendency of the variety with the high acid, then you get these even more aromatic tones. And I think that slight balsamic note of volatile acidity is so huge in Italian red wine, such a consistent identifier of the wines of Italy. Okay, so let us now proceed to our final wine, which is Nebbiolo. So why don't you guys pour your Nebbiolo and tell me once more what you are tasting in terms of aromas and flavors, and also at the same time where your wine comes from. I guess we always naturally think about Langhe, about Barbaresco and Barolo, but there are other regions as well. In Piemonte, like Gattinara, maybe someone's got Gattinara, delicious wines, and elsewhere as well in northern Italy. Okay, let me just put this back on the right slide. Okay, here we go. Gianluca has got a Vieti, a Langhe Nebbiolo. So Gianluca, that's I guess I have a little bit of an issue with that wine from Vieti because it's not an expensive wine, 25 euros or something like that, but it seems to be very tannic for a Langhe Nebbiolo, which, if you know the wines of Vieti, should come as no surprise. Vieti is just a very tannic traditional style of winemaking of the Nebbiolo variety. However, my feeling is that when people pay 25 euros for a bottle of wine, they don't expect they're going to have to put it in their cellar for 5 years. So I do think that perhaps Vieti could be a little bit more generous with their Langhe Nebbiolo, and perhaps leave all the tannins in the big Barolos and the cru Barolos. But that's just my thoughts about that. Okay, so what flavors and aromas are you guys getting? Such a beautiful variety to smell. I was commenting on the chocolatey note in the Sangiovese. I also get a kind of milk chocolatey note here. Kathleen has got a Langhe with cherry, raspberry, leather, anise, tar, roses, and earth. And Corey has got a Voezio Brunate from 2001. So wow, it's really great to have the opportunity to taste mature Barolo from a great vintage like that. Tar and roses, so like a very classic note for Corey. Louise baked cherry, cinnamon, cardamom, like those sweet spices. Orange peel. Orange peel, I think, is another great note of ripeness in Barolo or Barbaresco. Terracotta. Okay, good. Thank you, Louise. Also a note about the color, by the way. Maybe you compare it to the Sangiovese, which one has got lighter color? In my one, it's definitely the Nebbiolo. I'm moving from a Brunello to a Barbaresco. But possibly if you have a regular Chianti, that could also have a very pale ruby color, a bit like the Barolo. But you tell me what you have. Corey's enjoying the 2001. Yeah, I love that one. I mean, Voezio, we were just talking about Vieti being a traditional style of Barolo. Voezio is on the other end of the spectrum, very concentrated, rich, dense wines, which need a long time. But that example, 20 years old, that's long enough. And when you have that, I think Voezio can be a brilliant producer. It just needs a little bit of time. Jirin has got 2012 Barolo, strong herbal notes and mint, tart cherry, prune, dark chocolate, orange peel, cardamom, cloves, anise. I mean, the way that that you guys are able to come up with so many descriptions of the aromas is a statement in itself about the complexity of the wine, the complexity of the variety. So that's great. 14.5 alcohol, yeah, even on the old wine, 14.5 alcohol, I think is probably standard these days. I can't remember the last time I saw a Barolo or a Barbaresco at under 14%. Maybe a Langhe Nebbiolo, something like that, but not a Barolo Barbaresco. A lot of ripeness in this region. Late harvest variety Nebbiolo, traditionally harvested in October, very late, so that's a long hang time for those sugars to build up and the alcohol concomitantly to go up. Okay, tannins. Let's do our hard work now, and tell me about the level of tannins in your wine. I have a Barbaresco from 2014, and certainly I would say that my tannins are high. I'll have to compare it to the Brunello 2015 next to it to see whether they're more or less high, but certainly they're both high. Gianluca agrees with high for the Langhe Nebbiolo. He has, Corey says high for the Barolo. Louise saying high, but integrated, good. Kathleen agrees with high. So I think we are at a sort of agreement, a consensus about the level of tannins in Nebbiolo. I mean, to me, surely it is one of the highest tannin red varieties out there, particularly in the wine's youth, as you would expect. And traditionally a variety that needs a long time for those tannins to really mellow, to soften. Jirin agrees. Alice has got 2010 Barbaresco, which is lovely because 2010 is a great vintage, and it should be a nice time to drink that wine now. Okay, let's talk about the type of tannin. Find an adjective. What's your word? Are we still in the sandy territory of Sangiovese, or have we moved on to something different? Where are you going to go with Nebbiolo? Okay, Shengli, the 2013 Barolo is still quite high, and Shengli is commenting that in the Barolo there is high volatile acidity, the VA, the balsamic note that I was just talking about. So both found in the Sangiovese wines and in the Nebbiolo, sure. Again, that's a statement about how high the acidity is in the wine. You guys can tell me if you like, but I'm pretty confident that all of you will tell me that you've got high acidity in your Nebbiolo wine. Just the same as the Sangiovese. I repeat what I said earlier. Italian red wines are almost always built on the combination of tannins and of acidity. Not so much fruit, but tannins and acidity are just dominant features of these Italian reds, particularly these big ones that we're dealing with today. Kathleen is saying chalky tannins. Gianluca, silky and powerful. Good. Louise, smooth but clingy. They cling to your gums. Perhaps a bit like the grippy, they grip your gums that we were talking about last week in the context of the Bordeaux varieties. Kathleen agreeing with the high acidity. Okay, and finally, let's just take a look at the location of the tannins in the Nebbiolo. Do you feel them particularly strongly in one place or another? Okay. Kathleen's saying grippy. Gillian is saying sandy texture, but smoother than the Sangiovese. So somehow like the same texture, but also not quite the same. Corey's saying felt on the back of the gums. Gillian saying on the gums again, but seems to spread out more than the Sangiovese. Louise strong on the lower gums, but also on the upper gums. Kathleen, gums and cheeks. And Gillian also noticing that it kind of overflows from the gums into the cheeks. Kathleen noting on the back of the gums as well. So a lot of emphasis on gums here. Often what you can get with the, when you get cheeks is, I mean, if you think about it, I always talk about around the sides of the mouth. And of course, it's quite hard to find sometimes when the wine starts being felt in the cheeks as opposed to on these gums around the side. So there can be some overlap there for sure. Okay, good. So a lot of emphasis. So we're talking, it seems like high and then some kind of sandy or grainy note, and then maybe on the gums or in the cheeks. Okay, let's see what I have to say. Okay, so high levels of tannin, I think that's not controversial. The type of tannin, grainy. So grippy, I mentioned someone was talking about clingy. So grippy, I think you understand what I mean. Grainy, let's go back to grainy. So this, I think, is the point perfectly made by Gillian when he said, sandy texture, but smoother than the Sangiovese. So to me, the word for sandy but smoother is grainy. Reminder once again about what grainy means. Grainy means that it's like there's little bits that stick up, like the sand grains, but here there may be the grain may be slightly. If you imagine, I'm going to have to do this demonstration now, which I was practicing this morning. So supposing this is, you can see my knuckles like this. This is the ridges in my knuckles are the grain in Sangiovese, okay? And you can see that they stick up quite a lot, and that's the sandy grain. There's lots of little ridges. But what happens in Nebbiolo is that those ridges slacken off a little bit. So they kind of flatten out. So you can see that there are still peaks and troughs, and there are still high points and lower points. But those high points and lower points are elongated out away from the quick and sudden peaks and troughs of the Sangiovese, which is a sandy texture, and towards the longer grain texture of the Nebbiolo. Does that make sense? So you still get a sense of grain, but it's a longer grain. And that's why I compare the Nebbiolo to the long-grained rice. So this is my silly comparison. That Sangiovese is like short-grained rice because the grains are very short, hence sandy, as opposed to Nebbiolo where the grains are much longer and they're kind of flattened out. So they're long grains, they're grainy, but they're long grained. Or another way of discussing the same thing is under the other terms bullet point. You can see I've written tight weave versus loose weave. So again, this is a metaphor about materials in clothes or in other fabrics. So a tight weave would be like the long grain tannin, the long grain rice of Nebbiolo, where those ridges are a bit more flattened down. And the loose grain, imagine like something loose, like a piece of knitting where the wool goes down and comes up and like that. So that's the loose weave because there's lots of ups and downs. So the tight weave is Nebbiolo and the loose weave would be Sangiovese under this metaphor that I'm making. So Shengli is saying that the tannin appears finer than the Brunello. So Nebbiolo tannin is finer than the Sangiovese, says Shengli, and that's exactly what I agree with. Simply because the grain of the tannin is longer, so that there's less troughs, there's less places for your tongue to fall down into and then have to come out the other side again. Which means that the overall sensation is longer grained, it's more consistent, and more elegant as a result. It's more seamless. So fundamentally, this gets to the heart of why I think Nebbiolo tannins are ultimately, in the final analysis, of a higher quality to Sangiovese tannins, because they're longer and more elegant and more refined, rather than having the consistent peaks and troughs of the sandiness of Sangiovese. That's my idea. Let me just talk through the rest of this slide. Did I miss anything? Astringent. So astringent or austere. Astringent means almost dry to the point of bitterness. So even though those tannins are elegant, nonetheless, especially if you have a young wine, they can be so dry that it can be quite hard work. And it really offsets, you have that sour cherry fruit or the rose petals, all those kind of nice flavors and aromas that you have, but that can be offset by the dryness of the tannins, especially in those young examples. So that's what I mean by astringent. Some people say austere meaning very dry or serious. But that is it sounds like a criticism, but I do think it is an important assessment of Nebbiolo tannins in their youth. Now, many winemakers try and manage those tannins so they're never austere. And certainly I think that many of them are doing a great job of doing that. But some very traditional minded producers, like someone's got a Vietti example today, for instance, those tannins in their youth, before they've had time to polymerize and soften and mellow, they can be quite austere or astringent. Tight wave, mid-palate. Okay, let's just address mid-palate. So my contention with Nebbiolo is we're a bit back in the same situation as we were with Cabernet Sauvignon, which is that we've got powerful tannins felt on the gums, but limited mid-palate fruit. See what you guys think. And then compare the Nebbiolo to the Sangiovese in that context, in the sense of what's the balance between the Sangiovese tannin and the Sangiovese fruit. I asked you guys about the Sangiovese fruit and Sangiovese tannins and the balance, and no one had anything particular to say. And that completely makes sense to me, because I don't think there's anything remarkable about the two. I think there's more mid-palate in Sangiovese. I think there's a bit more generosity. So even though you get those sandy tannins, it's balanced out by the concentration of fruit in the middle. But what do you get in the Nebbiolo example? What are some of the ways a producer can moderate the tannins and make them less austere? Well, the most difficult process of all the processes involved in red wine making, Lynn, is extraction, how you manage extraction. So for instance, the whole Barolo, Barbaresco, Langhe region has gone through various iterations of what kind of extraction methods you use to get those tannins out of the skins and the pips of the grapes. And they use these things called roto-fermenters, some producers, which really are quite violent, but they ensure a tannin extraction. Of course, some people do the traditional punch down or the pump over, but very common now in the region is what's called the submerged cap, where you have a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, a device which pushes down the skins of the grapes and keeps them submerged under the cap, under the level of the liquid. So usually what happens in most red wines is that the skins are essentially floating on the surface of the wines. And that's why they have to be churned up, either by being pumped over or punched down, to ensure that there's contact between the skins and the juice. But in the case of Nebbiolo, a lot of producers in the region are now ensuring the skins are kept under the surface of the juice, which means that the extraction is going on permanently of tannins, but in a less violent way than by doing those traditional methods. Because if you're punching down or pushing and pumping over, then that can be quite rough on the skins of the grape, and it may leach out harsh tannins, bitter tannins. Whereas if you just keep the skins under the surface of the juice, then it can be a more gentle extraction, more like putting like a tea bag in a cup of tea. Okay, let's see what you guys are saying. Okay, so Jean-Luc commenting about the fruit in the mid palate. There is intensity, but not concentration. Therefore, tannins appear to be a bit harsher and not quite in balance with the level of the fruit. Right, I think this is the point. That especially at the beginning of its life, many Nebbiolo wines feel like the tannins are more powerful than the fruit because there's just not that much fruit in the middle. There's much better balance of those two in the Sangiovese. But over time, as the tannins soften in the Nebbiolo, then the two come back into balance. But it's a good reason to consider aging your Nebbiolo wines. Any other questions about Nebbiolo? Let's just go back one to the Sangiovese slide, just so you can compare and contrast. I do think that any of you guys who are taking exams, there is a lot of confusion among tasters between how to tell the difference between these two important Italian varieties. So the things I would point you to is the difference in that texture. Remember, between the sandy, short-grained, loose weave texture of Sangiovese tannins and the long, more elegant, tight weave of the Nebbiolo tannins. I think that's a qualitative difference in the quality of the tannins, and a battle which Nebbiolo probably wins. But where Sangiovese is so nice that it can have more mid-palate concentration of fruit in a young wine especially. And it can seem to be in a bit better harmony with its tannins than the Nebbiolo. And then I don't think also that Nebbiolo has that dustiness of the fruit. There's less of that too textured sensation, I think, in Barolo and Barbaresco as there is in the Sangiovese wines of Tuscany. Okay, let me just see whether you guys have got any other questions. Nebbiolo is a long-lived wine. Typically, says Jidin, do you think the structure changes at all? I mean, Jidin, I think it's just a question about the level of tannin. Sure, the level of tannin would change in these varieties, or at least our perception of that level, right? As the tannins polymerize, our perception of them certainly goes down. But I think the other aspects, the texture of them and the location of them, that doesn't change. Perhaps one thing that might happen is that you might have to work a bit harder to find the texture and the location, just because the tannins with age get more integrated into the fruit, into the body of the wine. But nonetheless, I think it's still pretty easy to do that. Someone gave me a 2009 Sangiovese the other day. So, you know, 2009 for a wine like a Chianti Classico, 10 years old, is a pretty good amount of time. There are not wines from Chianti Classico that last forever. The Reserve is obviously longer, but not the Normales. But the sandiness of the tannins just stood out for me so strongly that I was able to say, oh, I think that's what it was. Sure enough, it was. So I do think that you can find the consistency, at least in the type and the location of tannins. Jean-Luc is asking, can you detect the difference between tannins from the grape and the tannins from the maturation process, i.e. from the oak? Well, you know, the good thing, I think, in these two varieties, of course, there are some exceptions, but in general, in Italian winemaking, you're not using small oak and not small new oak very much, which means that the imprint of the tannins from the oak aging is very limited. Large and old vessels really don't leave a tannic imprint. But once again, as a reminder, we always talk about the fact that oak tannins from that aging in oak are generally felt around the gums, just like we've experienced today. So they would be harder to detect than, say, in Pinot Noir, where they're felt more on the tongue, right? So if you have the tannins on the tongue in Pinot Noir, but then you get all these tannins around the edge of your mouth on your gums, then you might consider whether that might come from oak in the case of Pinot Noir. But here, because the tannins are already on the gums, even if there were any of those oak tannins, they're going to be pretty well concealed because the tannins are already on the gums in the same place. Okay, so let me just wrap up here. Pinot Noir, the tannin is textured to me as my comment about what I call the mono texture of Pinot Noir, the seamless transition from fruit to tannin, all at the same texture, really gets to the heart of the wine's identity. That's very important. The graininess of the tannin in Italian wines, we could have used other Italian examples as well. Aglianico, I think, is probably the next great red variety from Italy, and also then Nebbiolo Mascalese from Sicily. Both of those examples would also feature some kind of graininess of tannin. So I do think the graininess is a consistent feature in Italian wines. So just look out for that, but also just bear in mind what I was saying about the difference between the short grain, what I call the short grain, and the long grain of Sangiovese and Nebbiolo. And then also think about mid-palate concentration. I don't want to get too hung up on this, but in the more northern region of Italy of Langhe, you have less mid-palate fruit, but tannin is very powerful. But then as you go further south into Tuscany, you get more mid-palate fruit, as you would expect. And then the tannins, even though they're still high, can seem to be a bit better balanced. So that's quite a good and consistent, reliable way, for me at least, to distinguish between them. Okay, any final questions, guys, before we wrap up for today? Next week, we are onto our final session with what I consider to be the what I call the Mediterranean varieties, ones grown around the Mediterranean in southern France and Spain, Syrah, Grenache, Tempranillo. So great diversity among those three varieties. So that's going to be a super interesting session. But thank you for being here today. If you have great comments and questions as always, and I will see you for the last time in this webinar series, same time next week. Thank you, guys.